Mallarme is one of the great inspirers and innovators of modern poetry, and his influence stretched far beyond poetry itself. He had a very inauspicious and uninteresting career. He taught English very chaotically to very undisciplined pupils somewhere in the French provinces, and eventually moved to Paris. And during his period in Paris, he had what are now known as Mallarme's Tuesdays. And at these meetings, the greatest painters, poets and musicians of the age congregated to talk in his flat. And the Mallarme's Tuesdays influenced art, literature and music in France and internationally, right through the many-seamed lines of the 20th century. Valéry, who is incredibly famous in France, was given a state funeral. I think probably the only poet who ever got a state funeral. Attended these, and his very important poem, La Cimetière Marin, Cemetery by the Sea, this was one of the results of Mallarme. Mallarme himself caught the essential visual quality of poetry. He was obsessed by le bleu, the blue, the eternal, the sky. And some of his poems are said to be untranslatable because there is a huge condensation in his work. I will read an example of that a little bit later. But I'll begin with a poem that I read probably 50-something years ago, which was a farewell poem to Gauguin, who was setting out for the South Sea Islands, and it's called Sea Breeze, which I'll read first in translation and then in the original. The flesh is sad, and I've read every book. Oh, to escape, to get away. Birds look as though they're drunk for unknown spray and skies. No ancient gardens mirrored in the eyes. Nothing can hold his heart steeped in the sea. Not my lamp's desolate luminosity, nor the blank paper guided by its white, nor the young wife feeding her child. O night, away! You, steamer, with your swaying helm, raise anchor for some more exotic realm. Ennui, crushed down by cruel hopes, still relies on handkerchiefs' definitive goodbyes. Is this the kind of squall-inviting mast that storm winds buckle above shipwrecks cast away? No mast, no islets flourishing. Still my soul, listen to the sailor's song. And in French, Brise marine. La chair est triste là, et j'ai lu tous les livres. Fuir, là-bas fuir, je sens que les oiseaux sont ivres d'être parmi l'écume inconnue et les cieux. Rien, ni les vieux jardins reflétés par les yeux, ne retiendra sa cour. Qui dans la mer se trompe aux nuits, ni la clarté déserte de ma lampe sur le vide papier que la blancheur défende, et ni la jeune femme allaitant son enfant. Je partirai. Steamer balançant amateur, lève l'ancre pour une exotique nature, un ennui, désolé par les cruels espoirs, croit encore à la Dieu suprême des mouchoirs. Et peut-être les mâts invitant les orages sont-ils de ceux qu'un vent penche sur les naufrages perdus sans main, ni fertile îlot, mais où mon cœur entend le chant des matelots. The sadness of the translation, of course, is it cannot capture the rhythmic structure, the rhyme of livre, ivre, cieux, yeux, trompe, lampe, défend, enfant, mature, nature. And this is a great problem with translating poetry which depends on an A-B rhyme scheme. And certain translators have tried to do this. I think there's some translations of Baudelaire and Laforgue, but they do not actually create the original, they simply destroy it. And I think this is better that we have basically prose translations and look at the poems bilingually. I don't think the last part of Mallarme's work was helpful. Mallarme began to write, and this is true not just of Mallarme but of other poets as well, he began to create a kind of poetry of space. In other words, he laid words out on a page and tried to create some kind of rhythmic pattern of spacings, which looks very strange, and although one can read it and translate it, to me this was not the way poetry would ever go, although a number of poets have followed this. And if you can see from a specimen page, this is very, very strange indeed, the way this is done. Very, very strange indeed. And the condensation which is there in some of his work is very difficult to translate, and to make any sense of, and to understand even in the original French. There is an interesting but not terribly good Penguin Classics French Poetry 1820-1950, which was edited by my son's French teacher, William Rees. And I think, to be honest, Rees made some huge errors in this book. He omitted poets, and some of the ones he is obsessed with are very minor indeed. However, he does include a translation of part of L'après-midi d'un faune, which of course became an opera, and I'm not very musically inclined, but I will read a few lines of this with a translation, and it is very difficult to actually work out what Mallarme was actually trying to say, even with a translation. Au bord sicilien d'un calme marécage, qu'à l'envie de soleil ma vanité saccage, tacite sous les fleurs d'étincelles, comptez que je coupais ici les creux roseaux domptés par le talent, quand sur l'or glauque de lointaine verdure dédiant le vigne à des fontaines, on doit une blancheur animale au repos. Et que ta prélude long où naissant les pipeaux se volent de cygne non, de naïade se sauve ou plonge. And the translation Rees comes up with in prose is, O Sicilian shores of a calm marsh that my vanity plunders, rivaling suns tacit beneath the flowers of the sparks, tell that I was cutting here the hollow reeds, tamed by talent, when on the glaucous gold of distant vergers, inscribing their vine on springs, an animal whiteness undulates to rest, and that at the slow prelude in which the pipes are borne, This flight of swans know of naiads, fleas or dives. One certainly gets some sense of rhetoric, of power, of inspiration, but to talk about meaning within a normal sense of the word is very difficult indeed. There is certainly a powerful juxtaposition of images, but Mallarme, in spite of his greatness, has never been a poet that I would personally read and reread as I would the work of successors such as Reverdy and Rader and Claudel, no doubt all of whom were in some ways, and this is unavoidable, that when you live in an environment where there are forerunners, then you will be influenced by them one way or another. French critic, the American critic Harold Bloom has written a book which has led to a huge, I think, school of criticism, which he calls a map of misreading. And Bloom puts forward the thesis that poets unintentionally misunderstand the work of their forebears. I think these kind of ideas, they go down well in critical circles and gain Bloom a lifetime of being a celebrated critic. But I think that poets do understand other poets, and they do understand their forebears. And the way they interpret their forebears, their own idiosyncratic inspirational writing, is not a misreading, but a personal reading which is then recreated in their own work. And there are influences in great poets, these are subtle, in minor poets, all too obvious. And it is very strange that certain poets have made reputation. I think particularly this is true in America, and their own creativity is very, very small indeed. And I'm not going to mention these poets, but I think if you look at the lists of famous poets, these poets were essentially imitators. It becomes very, very clear that they lack that inspiration. Mallarme had this. His work is extremely small in volume, but his influence is absolutely there for all of us to see, to hear, in opera as well as in poetry.